Alan Spector is the Distinguished Research Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Florida State University. And Alan, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Evangeline, and thanks for inviting me to share my views and experience on grant writing. I've been at this for a few decades now, and I've been asked to provide a brief overview of what the NIH R01 research grant is. I'm not going to spend as much time on that because I imagine many of you already know what it is, and a lot of this information is very clearly available online, and I'll show you how to get that information. What I'm going to spend more time on is discussing issues associated with writing the research plan. And there's no magic formula, I'm sorry to say. Each PI who has had some success at this has their own favorite style, and that's been primarily shaped over the years through operant conditioning. But what I'm going to share with you today is basically what I've learned over the years of writing R01s and serving on study sections. And while there's no perfect style, most PIs would agree on some common do's and don'ts, and so that's what we'll go over today. So what is the NIH R01? Well, it's your basic research grant, and basically it is as it says. It supports a discrete, specified, circumscribed project in the areas that you're an expert in, okay? And it has to be related to the programmatic mission of the institute that would be funding the grant. And you can find out more about the mission and strategic plans of institutes by going on to their webpage. You know, you may have to click a few buttons, but you can find this information. In terms of budget, there are basically two types. There's a type of budget called a modular budget, which is for annual direct costs every year would be $250,000 or less. And those budgets are arranged in increments of $25,000. So for example, if you had an annual budget of $210,000, you would ask for $225,000. And the nice thing about the modular budgets is that they don't need to be itemized. For budgets that are greater than $250K, those need to be itemized. And this 250 value has been around for, oh gee, I don't know, 20 years or so. It's time for them to change it because I think most people are forced now to go in with budgets that are greater than 250K because that is just what it costs. Now, if your budget is greater than $500,000, direct costs mean that's what you have to spend on your research, to pay your personnel, to buy things, and so forth. If it's greater than $500,000, you need to get prior approval from the Institute before you even submit. These are quite rare. I think most of you are going to be either in the modular range or in this itemized budget range. The duration of these grants runs from 1 to 5 years, but most of them are 3 years or greater. You'll see it takes a lot of effort to write these. You're not going to want to ask for just 1 year, but sometimes that's all you'll get. Now, for all kinds of NIH grants, there are page limits that vary. For the R01, it's not any different. I copied this table from one of the instructions. These red boxes are showing the sections where there's page limits, and these are what the page limits are. And you must follow those page limits. In fact, you must follow all of the instructions. Well, let me go back to this, because if you don't, and when you submit your grant to the Center of Scientific Review, otherwise known as Caesar. They're the ones that assign your application to an institute and to a study section. And they look through your application, and if they see that you haven't followed the font requirements or the margin requirements or the page limits, it's totally possible that they will send it back to you, and you will have no recourse but to wait until the next cycle to resubmit. So be sure to follow the instructions strictly. I just want to point out, this is a sample table of contents from one of my own recent R01 grant proposals. And I just want to show you that there's other parts of the R01 that we're not going to be discussing, like facilities and other resources, equipment, vertebrate animals, if you're using human subjects, that kind of information. Today, we're going to be focusing mostly on this part of the research plan, the specific aims and research strategy, and to some extent, if you have to resubmit, you get a one-page opportunity to write an introduction to show how you have responded to the criticisms. So here's a link right up here. Just click that link and it will take you to a site that has a PDF, and this is the front page of the PDF that has all the instructions that you need for the R01. Speaking of instructions, with all kinds of these grant mechanisms, they're a little bit of a moving target. And so, every once in a while, NIH changes the rules, like what your biographical sketch is supposed to look like, or rules for other support, or this or that. So always make sure you check the website, and you get the most recent version of the instructions and the rules, okay? I want to move on to the more difficult part, which is grant writing. And there's 6 basic truths to grant writing, in my opinion. First, you need a good idea, all right? If you don't have a good idea, chances are you're not going to get funded. However, if you do have a good idea, it doesn't mean you are going to be funded, all right? There's other factors that you have to take into account. You need to be a solid writer. And if you're not a solid writer, then do your best to improve your writing skills or get some help from somebody who is a solid writer. It's so important to be able to clearly articulate and communicate what your idea is and why it's important and how you're going to go about interrogating it. You need to be responsive to criticism because you're going to get a lot of it. First of all, if you give your grant proposal to a colleague who's generous enough to read it, they'll give you feedback, and you have to be responsive to that feedback. When you get your summary statement after the first review of your application from the study section, you'll need to be responsive to their criticisms. And your first reaction is always like, oh, well, they're being so stupid. They don't know this or they don't know that. I'm talking about the study section. But after a while, you calm down and you think about it and you realize, you have to address these concerns. Even if they're wrong, you have to find a way to address them. More on that a little later. You have to have a history of productivity appropriate for your rank. So if you're not publishing papers, it's going to be very difficult because they're not going to give you millions of dollars if you cannot demonstrate, if you don't have a history of bringing research to fruition, because you could do all the greatest research in the world, but if you're not disseminating those findings, then it's, in a way, it is literally worthless. And you need to have some luck. Now, there's nothing you can do about that, right? So you can only control what you can control, but at least control what you can control and put yourself in a position to take advantage of luck when it comes your way. And, the final point is you can't get a grant unless you write one. But don't submit a half-baked proposal. Over the years, I've had colleagues that had this strategy of saying like, well, I'm just going to, hurry up and write something up and just submit it and see what the study section wants. That's never a good idea for a variety of reasons. But one of the key reasons is that you want to put your best foot forward, and you don't want to be pegged as a person who is not thoughtful and careless, and because it's going to be hard to shake that reputation when you resubmit. All right, so always try to submit the best grant possible. All right, so let's talk a bit about the basic process. So you write the grant proposal, allow sufficient time. Personally, at this point in my career, I allow at least 2 months, sometimes 3. You should give it to senior colleagues in your area for feedback. If they're familiar with research, that's even better. But it doesn't hurt to have somebody who might be in your area but not familiar with your exact line of research, because they could look at it from a more naive perspective, because it's not always the case that every single reviewer that's going to be assigned to your grant is an expert in your area. So you submit the grant proposal. I've already giving you my spiel about following all the instructions. And then at that point, your grant proposal is assigned to an institute in the study section. And in your cover letter, there is an opportunity to write a cover letter, and you can recommend an institute and a study section that is appropriate for your proposal. And I suggest that you actually do that, and you do some homework on that to see which study section would be most appropriate and which institute would be most appropriate. But keep in mind, there's no guarantee that it will be assigned there. So usually a proposal is reviewed by 3 reviewers, and these panels vary in size. They're about maybe 20 or 30 panel members. And discussion of a grant is usually only 10 to 15 minutes tops. It's actually oftentimes less. That's not a lot of time, right? So, you need to get a sense for how this process unfolds. Incidentally, if any of you ever have an opportunity, if you're asked to serve on a study section, do it. Find the time and do it. It's an eye-opening experience, and it will be really helpful to you in terms of learning how the process works, and it will help you in your future grant proposals. Now, it turns out that only half of the grant proposals for a given round are reviewed by that study section. And so, and it's always a bummer if one of your grants, if it's the one that doesn't get discussed. You get the summary statements back that have the individual reviews of the reviewers assigned to the grant, but you don't have the benefit of the roundtable discussion, which is kind of important because sometimes a reviewer might make a mistake or might misunderstand something that another study section member or reviewer can correct. And so, but nonetheless, you get those summary statements back, and you should read them very carefully and respond to those criticisms. After the review, the score appears relatively quickly now on ERA Commons, really within a day or 2. The problem is the summary statements are not delivered for another 6 to 8 weeks. So, oftentimes if you see it's a score that's probably not going to be funded, you're just sitting with bated breath, waiting to see what the problem was and to get these summary statements back. There's 2 types of scores that you get. You get a priority score that ranges from 10 to 90, 10 being the best. And this reflects the average score from the study section. So after the grant is discussed, basically everybody votes on a score, okay? And that's done privately, and then those scores are averaged, and that's your priority score. But because different study sections are calibrated differently, like some study sections might be compressed towards the upper range, which is not uncommon, what NIH does for many grant mechanisms, but not all, but definitely for the R01, your proposal will receive a percentile score, and this reflects the percentage of proposals that scored better than yours in that particular study section for the most recent 3 rounds. They sort of keep a running average of that. And this way sort of evens the playing field so that it's the percentile score that drives funding decisions at institutes. And these days, in the institutes that fund my work, the percentiles, what we call the pay line, anything that's a better score than this percentile gets automatically paid, is running about 15%. So, it's not great, but it's been worse. It's also been better in my lifetime. I was in the late 90s when they started, or Congress decided to double NIH's budget. It got pretty good there, and the pay lines were around as high as 25%. So that was terrific. But for most of my life, they've been fairly low. So once you get your summary statements, review them carefully and highlight. Take a highlighter, or it's a PDF, just highlight every single criticism, no stone unturned, because you don't know which one was really the score driving issue. You can sort of find that out by calling your program officer. And I suggest that you do that, but don't do that until you get your summary statement. So you see what they say, you're going to have questions. Oftentimes program officers actually are allowed to sit in the review, and they do that. That's not always the case. Sometimes they have schedule conflicts, but oftentimes they're there. And they're not allowed to contribute to the review or anything. Sometimes they're asked certain questions about a programmatic issue or something like that. But they're taking notes. And so things like, gee, how important was this criticism relative to that criticism? They can give you some insight. Moreover, you want to get on the program officer's radar screen, okay? You want to develop a rapport with that program officer and a relationship with that program officer. That's their job. That's their job. They're the liaison between you and the institute, okay? And their job is in part to give you advice on how to optimize, your proposal. And to give you truthful information about how competitive they think your idea is and so forth. And so they can be very helpful. And down the road, they could be involved in a decision to fund or not if your grant just misses the pay line. So if you decide to resubmit, all right, and I have to tell you right now, very few grants get funded on the first submission. So you usually do have to resubmit. You're allowed a 1-page introduction, and it's kind of tough to write. 1 page isn't very long. And so you have to find a way to concisely summarize how you addressed the concerns raised in the prior review. For something like this, an experienced senior colleague can really help you design what that page should look like. And, in responding to these, you need to find a way to address every concern. It's certainly the most important ones, but don't get combative, in your response. Even if you were right, take the blame. All right. The way to do this is, well, obviously, I did not sufficiently articulate this point, and then you make your point, because if you're right, you're right. But, just take the blame as in terms of not explaining it well. The study section is never wrong. That's sort of the mentality you need to develop. So let's look at a typical timetable. So if it's your first submission, and that's called an A0, that's the NIH lingo. So that's the first submission. There are 3 times a year you can submit an A0. It's on February, June, and October 5th, okay? And so let's look at February 5th. If you were to submit by that date, and you should work with the Division of Sponsored Research, or if you have somebody in your department who's a grants management specialist, work with them. They're there to help you. And, you typically need to be getting it through the university before the 5th so that they can approve it and so forth. It would get reviewed in June or July, and then in August or so, maybe a little earlier, you would receive the summary statements. Maybe you get a request for just-in-time JIT documentation, which would be great, because if you're getting a request for that, it means they think your grant might get funded, okay? And this is information the Institute needs to process the grant so that they can transfer the funds to your institution. Generally in October, that's when the Institute Advisory Council, every institute has an advisory council of experts in the field. They meet and they make the final decision on funding. Generally, like I said, there's an automatic pay line. So if you're better than that percentile score, you're going to get automatically paid. But then they set aside some money for special consideration of grants that scored well, but they weren't below that automatic pay line. And so if they're meeting certain programmatic needs, those can get funded. And that's where a program officer can potentially step in and help. So if you have to resubmit, the earliest resubmission for now what would be called an A1 would be on November 5th. So for R01s, the resubmission deadlines are a month later than the first submission deadlines. So instead of February, June, October 5th, it's March, July, and November 5th for resubmission. So you get an extra month on a resubmission. Now, if you didn't have to resubmit, the earliest starting date would be December 1st, but it may not be December 1st because sometimes the Institute, for whatever reason, might be a little later. So December 1st would be the earliest, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll get paid then. It could be in January or February. Now, if you do need to resubmit, so here we go, November 5th. Then that would get reviewed January or February. You'd receive the summary statement in March. The advisory council would meet in May, and the earliest possible starting date would be July 1st. Now, this is now the following year. So from your initial A0 submission date to funding of the second submission, in my example here, is 19 months. It could actually be longer. It could be up to 2 years. That's like a long time. So this is why you got to be thinking ahead, because this is not a quick process. Okay, so now we're going to get a little more into the grant writing. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is that you need to mind the study section. In other words, keep in mind the audience to whom you are writing, which is the study section. So find out who's on the study section. This is public information, and it's really absolutely critical. They publish rosters. Now, the trouble is that sometimes those rosters change because somebody can't make particular study section that round or so forth, but you can generally see what the composition is. And so therefore, after looking that over, be sure to cover your bases, if necessary, on areas of research for which the members of the study section have expertise. You know, you want to make sure that you're demonstrating good scholarship, that you have your, I's dotted and your T's crossed. If you can, cite their work where appropriate. Don't do it gratuitously. That's not going to look good. But, if they have relevant publications to your problem that you're proposing, make sure that they're included, because they're going to notice when they're not included. And you can usually identify a 2 to 3 person pool from the panel that would likely be primary and or secondary reviewers. And what you're writing to them, you need to convince them that your grant is worth funding, and they have to become your allies. And there are only a few grants that they will be able to advocate for. And so you have to make their job easy. So first you have to convince them, but then after you convince them, you got to give them ammunition to defend your grant. Okay. It's sort of like providing evidence to an advocate in a legal case. Each reviewer gets around 10 grants to review, and they're reading these at night and on weekends for 5 weeks, sometimes less. And so you got to make yours stand out positively. And you have to make it easy to understand and to follow. This is why writing is so important. A little more on this later. So now for what I'd like to do is break up the discussion into first scientific issues that you need to be aware of, and then writing style issues. So let's start with scientific issues. So there's there's the kind of science you're conducting. Is it hypothesis testing, or is it exploratory / descriptive? Okay. Now, right or wrong, study sections prefer hypotheses. Personally, I think exploratory and descriptive science is really critical and important and of great value. So I'm not one of those reviewers that places so much emphasis on this, but many reviewers do. So but if you don't have a true hypothesis, if it's really exploratory in nature or descriptive, you can still find a way to frame your proposal in a hypothesis kind of way. So if you can, then do that. You have to show that your specific problem it fits some kind of global view. You don't want to propose an idea that's just very arcane. You need to point out that you plan to work, okay, yes, on a well-defined piece of a much larger, well-defined problem. Okay, because that will be really critical in terms of the significance of your proposal. So again, you need a good idea, and then when you're writing your specific aims, and I'll get a little bit more in detail about specific aims shortly, they should be concise and clear. Feasibility: can you perform the manipulations? Can you get it done in the time frame proposed? Do you possess the necessary facilities and resources? Is your proposal designed such that if your first specific aim fails, then all of the others cannot be achieved? That is a fatal flaw. All right, you can't have your specific aims dependent on an outcome of another specific aim. That's fatal. Sufficient experimental design. Here's just a list of some of the things. Of course, there are others that would be more specific to your problem, but these are just some of the common general ones. Do you have a sufficient sample size? It's always nice if you can to conduct a power analysis and demonstrate that the sample sizes you're proposing are sufficient. Now, over the last few years, you need to have a section on sex as a biological variable. So NIH now requires that both males and females be included in experimental designs unless otherwise justified scientifically. So, you might be able to justify it scientifically, but you just can't ignore it. You have to address it. Have you chosen an appropriate animal model if it's non-human research? Or if it's human research, have you chosen a proper population from which to sample? Are your critical parametric choices justified? This one I commonly see as a problem in grants. So, your doses, your concentrations, the times, the session length, whatever. Okay, you need to justify this. You can't just say, okay, this is what I'm going to do and specify what it is. That's fine, but you got to say, where did this value come from? Okay, and what you're trying to demonstrate is that this is a good value, that this is an appropriate value. Okay, and if you're not sure, then maybe you've got to run a parametric, dose response type of experiment in order to choose the proper dose for later studies. Are your experimental designs quick and dirty, or are they comprehensively planned? Obviously, the latter would be better. Do you have sufficient control groups if appropriate? And is your planned data analysis sufficiently explained? If you stumble on these, and there's probably some others, like I said, that are more specific to your problem, it's going to be recognized in the summary statement. Potential outcomes. This is really important. You need to have a section that describes what your potential outcomes are and what will each outcome mean interpretively as it relates to the specific problem and, space permitting, the big picture. Sometimes I've reviewed grant proposals that don't sufficiently describe what they expect. And by the way, when you're thinking of potential outcomes, you also have to think not only about what you think will happen, your favored prediction, but you also have to describe what will it mean if it doesn't turn out the way you think it will. Okay, that's really important. Potential problems. We all know nothing works as planned, right? So what are the possible complications that might arise, and what contingencies do you have for dealing with them? You can't go on and on about this because you only have so much space, but it shows thoughtfulness to the study section. Never try to finesse or hide a weakness in design or interpretation. A study section will always find those, and you'll look like you weren't sharp enough to realize they existed. So if there are weaknesses, address them outright. Is the science exciting to you? If it's not, it's going to be difficult to write a proposal that excites others. There have been some occasions over my career where I sat down to write a grant. I was struggling. I was really struggling writing, and I realized that, well, it's because it wasn't a good idea. Okay, and it was just back to the drawing board. Did you demonstrate reasonable command of the relevant literature? You need to show, scholarship. Now, you don't have enough space to write a review, but key citations should be there. Again, if you suspect a certain scientist will be on the study section, certainly if they have relevant references, include them. And if there's a controversy in the field, and there normally is, be sure to present both sides. Even if you prefer one side, try to maintain an objective voice. All right, so now style issues. Be neat and organized. Use headers and subheaders. Yes, they waste a little bit of space, but it's not really waste, right? Because it's helping organize the flow of information. So also use bold and underline, italics, outline, to provide emphasis and to help break the document up into logical subdivisions. Do not have long, long, long paragraphs with no white space because you're trying to cram all this information in because you think it's just so absolutely critical. Sometimes less is more, all right? The other side of that is don't have large amounts of white space on the page because that can give the impression that there was more that should have been said and that could have been said, okay? Use tables and figures where appropriate. A picture really is 1,000 words. Nothing beats a nice figure depicting some important point that is central to your proposed research. And, in most R01, certainly from established investigators, preliminary data is essential, and this is where figures can really help show that there is there's something worth studying here. The other nice thing about figures and tables is that the font requirements for figures and captions do not have to meet the minimum requirements as they do for the text. I believe it's 11 point for the text, but they can be smaller for captions and tables as well. But don't exploit that. Even though they get reviewers get PDFs of these and they can enlarge them, you don't want to annoy reviewers and make it too difficult. Same thing with tables. The font requirements are relaxed. I've used them on occasion to summarize certain findings in the literature. I've used them to summarize parameters of some technique or listing even potential outcomes in their interpretations. I mean, you got to be careful not to overdo that. And it shouldn't be a real replacement for the text. And you want to make sure that you choose your tables and your figures carefully because, they can detract from a proposal and they are costly in space. One practical note is Word can be very annoying sometimes when you're trying to format tables and figures and wrap text around them. And what I learned several years ago is it's a lot easier to do that if you put the figure and the table or table in a text box. Then it's easier to move the text box around. I threw that in for free. All right, so writing style. Write scientific American style. Don't try to sound complicated. You're going to live or die on the basis of your idea. So, make sure you clearly convey what that idea is. In my opinion, it's good to funnel the reader, start broad and methodically focus the reader on the importance of your specific problem. Try to avoid jargon and be sure to define abbreviations. I mean, abbreviations and acronyms, they are space saving. But, if you overuse them, it can be really difficult to read the document. So use them judiciously. And generally redundancy is, to be avoided in grant writing in writing, but in grant writing, it can be an effective way to keep reminding the reader of important points throughout the application. Page distribution, so you have 12 pages for the research strategy plus 1 page for the specific aims, and that's not much. So use them wisely. You must be clear and concise. I don't know what to tell you in terms of general breakdown. So you have your specific aims. Well, that's easy, 1 page. The significance, so for the 12 pages of the research strategy, it needs to be broken down into significance, innovation, approach. These are what I would recommend as page ranges, but they can change depending on what your needs are. So for example, if you're putting a lot of preliminary data in the approach, rather than the significance, then you may want to decrease this and increase this. But this just gives you a general idea. I would not spend more than a half a page, and you could spend even less than a half a page on innovation, all right? You ought to be able to say what's innovative about the grant. First of all, it should be obvious, right? So I just never waste too much space on that. So the approach section doesn't have to be organized in, as I discussed in my prior slides. But all that information, all those scientific issues, they should be addressed in the approach section. So just a little more specific information. For the specific aims, I would generally start with 1 to 3 paragraphs to provide some very basic context to set them up. I personally like to list them in bold. I number them and I separate them by a line. I indent if I can, if I have space. And I like to keep each aim limited to 1 or 2 sentences. This way I can use them later on as headers for the approach. But there are different styles for specific aims that can be effective. For the significance section, this is where you provide the reviewer with the pertinent literature that's important to understanding the significance of the proposal. Again, funnel the reader, and remember, use bold headers and be careful that the text isn't too dense. For innovation, just try to do your best highlighting what's novel and unique about your proposal. You should be able to, at the very least, point out how your grant is conceptually innovative, even if it's not methodologically innovative. For approach, best to organize, in my opinion, by aims and by experiments. If you have general methods that cut across all of the aims and experiments, then it's good to have a general methods section that you can refer back to. It's very space efficient. You need to provide enough detail. You can refer to published work, but provide enough detail that the reviewer knows what you're going to do and that it's justified. Be very clear about your experimental design, the possible outcomes and interpretations, they need to be discussed, potential problems, and then it's good to have a projected timetable. Now, if you don't have the space for the table, you can fit that information into the text as you're going. Okay, next last slide. Here are some issues that will lead to your grant not being funded. Poor writing, mediocre idea, lack of feasibility, poor research design, flawed or missing interpretation of potential outcomes, poor facilities or resources, poor or modest productivity. One or more specific aims depends on a specific outcome of another specific aim. You didn't include both sexes without providing justification, or you lack some critical detail. And there's probably others that I've left out, but these are some common ones. And I'll just end with this last slide, which is be relentless. You got to develop a thick skin. My heart's been broken many times over the years, and it's always a bummer and devastating when you get, scored it's not funded and you read the summary statements. But, you just turn around and you address the criticisms and you send it back. And, in my experience, if you keep doing these things, with some luck, eventually you'll be funded.